They tied a Hell's Angel's wife and daughter to their home fence. It was the biggest mistake of their lives. The sun had barely climbed over the tree line when Bear Kelly settled his weight onto Widow Hendrick's roof. Knees braced against the slope, hammer swinging with the easy rhythm of a man who'd done this work 1,000 times before. The morning air was cool and smelled like wet grass and pine smoke from some neighbor's early fire. Below him, the little house on Maple Street looked smaller than it used to, the paint on its shutters peeling a bit more each year, same as its owner. Bear drove another nail home, the sound sharp and clean in the quiet street. He liked mornings like this. No phones ringing, no club business, no worries about the toy drive or the fund or any of the 100 things that pulled at him during the day. Just him, a roof, and the simple satisfaction of fixing something that was broken. Marcus Kelly, you are going to give yourself a heart attack up there. He glanced down to see Widow Hendricks standing at the bottom of her rickety ladder, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee and wearing her housecoat, and a scowl that didn't fool him one bit. She was 80 if she was a day, small and stooped, with white hair pulled back in a bun and eyes that missed nothing. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. Mrs. Hendricks, you're going to give yourself one, standing there with hot coffee and no proper shoes on, Bear called back. But he was already climbing down, careful and slow, until his boots hit solid ground. Don't you sass me, she said, though her eyes crinkled with a smile as she handed him a mug. This is the 3rd time this month you've come out here. Your own house needs things done, I'm sure. Your wife needs you. And here you are, patching my old roof for free. It's not free, Mrs. Hendricks. You paid me in coffee. Best deal I ever made. Bear wrapped his big hands around the mug, steam curling up past his thick beard. He was a mountain of a man, all leather vest and weathered skin, tattoos peeking out from his sleeves. But there was something soft in the way he looked at her, something patient. I mean real payment. Money. I've got some put away. You keep that money for yourself. Buy something nice. New shoes maybe, since you keep coming out here in your slippers. He nodded toward her feet, and she looked down like she'd forgotten what she was wearing. Oh, hush. But she didn't argue further. She never did, not really. She just patted his arm, the way she'd done every time before, like she was memorizing the feel of it, and turned to head back inside, calling over her shoulder that there was more coffee if he wanted it. Bear finished his mug slow, looking up at the roof one more time to check his work. Solid. It would hold through the next storm, and the one after that, probably longer than the widow herself would need it. That was fine by him. That was the whole point. He loaded his tools into the bed of his truck, the old thing rattling as he shut the tailgate and started the engine. The drive home took him past the bakery, dark and quiet this early, past the school, past the Iron Guardians clubhouse with its motorcycles lined up like sleeping animals under the carport. Millbrook was still waking up, slow and easy, same as it did every morning. When he pulled into his own driveway, he found Sarah already outside, her hair tied back and a flower still dusted on one cheek from an early morning at the bakery, hauling a cardboard box towards the bed of his truck. Inside, through the box's open flaps, he could see stuffed animals and wrapped board games, donations for the run. Morning, she said, setting the box down with a grunt. Ruth dropped off another load last night. I think we've got triple what we did last year. Before Bear could answer, the screen door banged open and Emma came flying out, softball bag slung over one shoulder, cleats untied and flapping. Bye, Dad. Bye, Mom. I'm gonna be late, she shouted, already halfway down the walk. Emma, your shoes, Sarah called after her. No time, Emma yelled back. not even turning around. "See you in 2 days, Dad, when you're back from the run." The Iron Guardians clubhouse sat at the edge of town, a long metal building with a gravel lot and a faded sign over the door that read, "Iron Guardians MC," in letters Bear had painted himself, back when the club was young and the town still locked its doors when the bikes rolled through. Things were different now. The lot was clean, the grass out front mowed, and somebody had planted flowers along the walkway last spring, though nobody would admit who. Bear pulled his truck in around noon and found his brothers already gathered, 6 men in leather vests standing around a folding table covered in maps and lists. Tank Morrison looked up first, a grin spreading across his broad face. "There he is," Tank said. "Fixing roofs again? You smell like sawdust, Bear." "Widow Hendrick's roof needed patching," Bear said, dropping into a chair at the head of the table. "Don't start with me, Tank." "Wouldn't dream of it." Tank slid a printed map across the table, routes marked in red marker. "We got the Millbrook run mapped out, 3 stops for pickups, then we head out to meet the Riverside chapter Thursday morning. They got 2 truckloads of toys waiting on us." Bear studied the map, tracing the route with one thick finger. Around him, the other men talked low, checking gear, comparing notes on which roads still had potholes from the spring thaw. There was an easy rhythm to it, the kind that came from years of riding together, years of trusting each other with more than just directions. "We still doing the school stop Friday?" asked Cutter, a wiry man with a gray beard who'd been riding with Bear since before Emma was born. "Yeah," Bear said. "Emma's got a game Friday evening, so we need to be back by 4. I already promised her." "You and that girl," Cutter said, shaking his head, but he was smiling. "Softest heart in the club, and everybody still crosses the street when they see him coming." "Not everybody," Tank said. As if on cue, a patrol car rolled slow down the road outside the clubhouse, and Sheriff Dale Whitfield leaned out the window, one arm resting on the door. He didn't stop, just gave a 2-finger wave and a nod toward Bear before rolling on, unhurried, like a man checking in on old friends rather than watching for trouble. Bear lifted his coffee mug in return. A few years back, that same sheriff had pulled him over twice a month, looking for any excuse. Now he waved like they'd known each other their whole lives. That was the whole difference, right there. Not that Bear had changed who he was, just that folks had finally started looking past the leather to see the man underneath. "See that?" Tank said, watching the patrol car disappear around the bend. "Used to be we couldn't ride through town without somebody calling the station." "Times change," Bear said. "People change, if you give them a reason to." They spent another hour going over the details, splitting up who would drive which truck, who would handle the paperwork for the donation drop, who would call ahead to the Riverside chapter to confirm the meeting time. By the time they finished, the maps were folded, the coffee pot was empty, and the sun had started sliding low behind the trees, painting the gravel lot gold and orange. 2 days, Tank said, clapping Bear on the shoulder as they walked out. "We'll have those trucks loaded and back before Emma even notices you're gone." "She noticed the second I left this morning," Bear said, and Tank laughed, a big booming sound that carried across the lot. The brothers loaded up their bikes, checking mirrors, strapping down gear, the low grumble of engines starting one by one until the whole lot filled with sound. Bear swung his leg over his own bike, feeling the familiar weight of it settle under him, solid and steady as an old friend. He looked around at his brothers, 6 men who'd stood by him through years of proving themselves to a town that hadn't wanted to believe in them, and felt something warm settle in his chest. "Let's ride," he said, and pulled out of the lot, engine roaring beneath him, his brothers falling into formation behind. The morning sun came up soft and gold over Millbrook, and Sarah Kelly unlocked the front door of her bakery, just as she did every day, the little bell above the frame giving its cheerful jingle. The smell hit her first, like it always did. Warm bread, cinnamon, butter melting into dough. She breathed it in and smiled to herself, flipping the sign from closed to open. Sarah's Sweet Stop wasn't much to look at from the outside. Just a small brick building on Main Street with a striped awning and a window box full of red geraniums. But inside, it was full of light and warmth, with mismatched chairs Sarah had collected from yard sales over the years, and a big chalkboard menu that changed depending on her mood. Today it said, cinnamon rolls, blueberry muffins, and whatever Ruth orders me to make. She'd barely gotten the ovens going when the bell jingled again, and Mrs. Fenwick shuffled in, same as she did every Tuesday, her silver hair pinned up neat under a wool cap, even though it wasn't cold out. "Morning, Sarah," Mrs. Fenwick said, settling onto her usual stool by the counter. "Is Bear off on his toy run already?" "Left yesterday," Sarah said, sliding a warm muffin onto a plate and setting it in front of her. "Him and the boys are meeting the Riverside chapter. Should be back Thursday." "That man never stops moving," Mrs. Fenwick said, shaking her head, though there was fondness in her voice now, not the wariness Sarah remembered from years back. "You'd think after all these years he'd slow down some." "He tried slowing down once," Sarah said, laughing. "Lasted about a day before he was out fixing somebody's fence." The morning rolled on like that, one regular after another. Mr. Doyle came in for his black coffee and asked how Emma's softball season was going. Two young mothers came by with strollers, chatting about the upcoming Toy Drive Gala, while their toddlers eyed the display case with wide eyes. Sarah moved through it all easy and light, wiping counters, refilling the coffee pot, wrapping up an extra roll for anyone who looked like they needed a little sweetness in their day. By mid-afternoon, the lunch rush had died down, and Sarah took a moment to lean against the counter, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. Ruth Alvarado came in around 2, same as she often did, settling into the corner table with a cup of tea and a folder of papers she was always working through. "Numbers looking good for the fund?" Sarah asked, setting a slice of lemon cake in front of her. "Numbers are numbers," Ruth said, adjusting her reading glasses. "I'll let you know when they start telling me something interesting." Sarah laughed and left her to it, moving on to the next customer, the next order, the next small piece of her ordinary happy life. This was what she loved about the bakery. Not just the baking, though she loved that too, but the way it put her right in the middle of everything, the beating heart of Millbrook, where she could hear all the small stories that made up the town. By the time she flipped the sign back to closed that evening, her feet ached and flour dusted her apron from top to bottom, but she felt good. Full, in the way a day of good work makes a person feel. She got home just before Emma did, and had barely gotten the kitchen going when she heard the front door bang open and Emma's cleats clatter against the hardwood floor. "Mom, we won again," Emma called out, dropping her bag by the stairs. "Coach says if we win Friday, we're first in the league." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Sarah said, pulling out 2 plates. "Wash up, dinner's almost ready." They sat together at the small kitchen table, plates of pasta and salad between them. The house quiet, except for their voices. Emma talked about practice, about her batting average, about how nervous and excited she was for Friday's game. Then, as she twirled pasta around her fork, her whole face lit up. "Mom, is Dad going to be back in time for the gala?" she asked. "I heard we're getting new donations this year. Mrs. Alvarado said it might be the biggest one yet." "He wouldn't miss it," Sarah said, smiling. "You know your dad. That gala means everything to him." They talked a while longer about decorations, about what dress Emma might wear, about the toys already piling up at the clubhouse, waiting to be wrapped and given away. The diner sat off the highway like it had been dropped there by accident. A low building with a buzzing neon sign that read "Eat" in pink letters, one of the E's flickering like it couldn't quite make up its mind. Inside, the place smelled like coffee that had been on the burner too long and bacon grease that had soaked into the walls over 40 years of breakfast rushes. Bear loved it. He sat in a booth built for 4 but crammed with 6 leather vests, his boots stretched out into the aisle, a mug of black coffee steaming in front of him. Around him, his brothers filled the small space with noise. Tank was in the middle of a story about a raccoon that had gotten into his garage, waving his fork around for emphasis, and Diesel was laughing so hard he had to set his own fork down before he choked. "I'm telling you," Tank said, "that thing looked me dead in the eye like it paid rent." "You probably ran," Diesel said. "I did not run." "Tank, you screamed." "I hollered. There's a difference." Bear leaned back and laughed, a deep, warm sound that came easy these days. Years ago, a laugh like that would have surprised him, back when most of his days were heavy with anger he didn't know what to do with. Now it came natural, the same way breathing did. He looked around the table at his brothers, really looked, the way he liked to sometimes. Tank, steady as a mountain. Diesel, always quick with a joke. Otis and Pike arguing over the last piece of toast like a couple of kids. Rooster quiet in the corner, nursing his coffee, smiling along. This was the good part of the life he'd built. Not the leather, not the bikes, though he loved those too. It was this. Men who'd stand beside him through anything, sharing a laugh in some run-down diner 3 counties from home, all because they believed in the same thing he did. Toys for kids who wouldn't get much else this Christmas. A little bit of good pushed out into a world that could always use more of it. His phone buzzed against the table, rattling his fork against his plate. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. "Probably a robocall," he muttered, swiping it to voicemail without much thought. Diesel had moved on to a story now about somebody's cousin who was scared of geese, and Bear returned to laughing along, sliding his phone back into his pocket without a second look. It buzzed again a minute later. A voicemail notification this time. Bear frowned, pulled it back out, and held it up to his ear, plugging his other ear with a finger to block out the diner noise. The voice on the recording was muffled, half swallowed by static, like it had been recorded in a car with the windows down. He caught pieces of it. "Time to settle. Old debt. Kelly knows what he owes." Then it cut out into a burst of noise before going silent. Bear pulled the phone away from his ear and stared at it like it might explain itself. He played it again, straining to catch more, but it was the same broken mess. No name. No number he recognized. Just those few words, tangled up in static. "Everything all right?" Tank asked, catching the look on Bear's face. "Yeah," Bear said, though he said it slower than he meant to. "Just some weird voicemail. Somebody talking about an old debt." "Debt?" Tank raised an eyebrow. "You still owe somebody money from back in the day?" Bear thought about it, really thought, running through old faces, old deals, old grudges from a life he'd left behind years ago. Nothing came up. No names, no debts he could recall. Whatever this was, it didn't fit anywhere in the ledger of his memory. "Nah," Bear said finally, shaking his head and sliding the phone back into his pocket. "Probably some wrong number, or some old rival trying to stir up trouble because he's bored. Wouldn't be the first time somebody tried to rattle me with nothing." Tank shrugged, satisfied with that, and turned back to needling Otis about the toast. Bear let it go too, draining the last of his coffee and waving over the waitress for the check. Outside, The bikes sat waiting under the darkening sky, chrome catching the last orange light of evening. Within the hour, they were back on the road, engines roaring steady beneath them, the diner shrinking into a pinprick of light behind them as they rode on toward the next chapter's clubhouse, the night stretching wide and dark on all sides. Sarah Kelly moved through the house the way she did every night, checking locks, turning off lights, the small rituals of an ordinary evening. The kitchen smelled like the last batch of cinnamon rolls she'd tested for the bakery, a recipe she was thinking about adding for the holidays. Upstairs, she could hear Emma's music playing soft behind a closed door, the kind of music that meant homework was probably not getting done. But Sarah let it go. It was Friday. Emma deserved a little slack. She flipped off the porch light out of habit, then flipped it back on when she remembered Bear liked it left on for him, even though he wouldn't be home for 2 more days. Just in case, she told herself. Just so the house looked awake. The wind outside picked up, rattling the old oak tree that shaded the yard, and somewhere down the road a dog barked twice and went quiet. Sarah didn't think anything of it. Millbrook nights were like that, full of small sounds that didn't mean anything. She was locking the back door when she heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. Not a car she recognized, no headlights sweeping across the ceiling like they usually did. Just tires on gravel, slow and careful, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard. "Emma?" she called up the stairs, trying to keep her voice light. "You expecting anyone?" No answer. The music upstairs kept playing. Sarah stepped toward the front window, pulling the curtain back an inch. That was when she saw them. 4 shapes moving across the lawn, black ski masks pulled tight over their faces, boots crunching over the grass Bear had mowed just that weekend. One of them carried something long and dark in his hand. It took her brain a second to understand it was a gun. Her whole body went cold. "Emma!" she screamed this time, no softness left in it. "Emma, get down here now!" But it was too late. The front door burst open before Emma even made it to the top of the stairs, wood splintering off the frame, and 2 of the masked men were already inside, filling up the small living room with their size and their silence. "Out!" one of them barked, voice muffled behind the mask. "Both of you, outside, now!" Sarah's hands shook as she reached for Emma, who had come down the stairs frozen, eyes wide, one hand still gripping the phone she'd probably been using to text a friend a second ago. Sarah pulled her daughter close, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, trying to shield her, though there was nothing she could do against 4 men with a gun. "Please," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "Whatever this is, we don't have money. We don't have anything. Please just leave my daughter out of this." Nobody answered her. One of the men shoved her toward the door, not hard, but firm enough that she stumbled, catching herself on the frame. Emma held her hand so tight it hurt. Outside, the night air felt sharp against Sarah's skin, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. The men marched them across the lawn toward the wrought iron fence that lined the edge of the property, the same fence Bear had repainted just last spring, black and glossy, decorative curls twisting along the top. "Sit," one man said, pushing Sarah down against one of the fence posts. Another grabbed Emma, forcing her down a few feet away. Sarah felt the plastic bite into her wrists as they zip-tied her hands behind her back, looping through the iron bars. She heard Emma gasp beside her as the same thing happened to her, the zip tie cinching tight enough to sting. One of the men pulled out a phone, holding it up, the flash going off twice, 3 times, capturing the 2 of them there, terrified, tied like something out of a nightmare neither of them had ever imagined living. "Tell Kelly," a voice said, low and distorted like it was being run through something electronic. "He knows what he owes. This is just a reminder. Next time won't be so gentle." Then, As quickly as they'd come, the men were gone, boots pounding back across the lawn, engines roaring to life somewhere down the road, tires screeching against asphalt as they sped off into the dark. Down the street, a porch light flicked on, someone's curtain twitching aside to see what all the noise had been about. Mr. Alvarez had lived next to the Kelly place for 11 years, and in that time, he'd learned the rhythm of their nights the way he knew the creak of his own porch steps. He was 73 years old, a retired mailman with bad knees and a good heart, and he was standing at his kitchen window filling a glass of water when he heard the engines roar away down the street. He almost didn't look. His hearing wasn't what it used to be, and cars sped down that road more than they should. But something made him glance out anyway. Some old instinct that had never quite left him, even after all these years of quiet retirement. That was when he saw them. Two shapes against the black iron fence, slumped and still in a way that made his stomach drop. "Dios mío," he whispered, the glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the tile floor. He didn't even look down at the mess. He was already moving. His hands shook as he grabbed the phone off the wall, the same rotary style he'd refused to replace even when his daughter bought him a fancy new one for Christmas. He dialed 911 with fingers that felt too big for the numbers. "There's been an attack," he said, his voice tight and breathless. "Kelly Place, on Larkspur. 2 people tied up, I think it's Sarah and the girl. Please, send someone quick." The operator asked him questions, but he was already setting the phone down, letting it dangle from its cord while he yanked open the kitchen drawer and grabbed the biggest knife he owned. It wasn't much of a weapon, just an old bread knife with a serrated edge, but it would cut through whatever those men had used to tie them. He grabbed his coat off the hook by the door and hobbled outside as fast as his knees would let him, cutting across his own lawn and through the gap in the hedge that separated the 2 properties. The cold air bit at his face, but he barely noticed it. "Sarah," he called out, his voice cracking with the effort of hurrying. "Sarah, it's Ray. I'm coming." He reached them within a minute, though it felt like an hour. Sarah's face was pale in the moonlight, streaked with tears, and Emma was shaking so hard her teeth chattered audibly. Neither of them could speak, not really, just small, broken sounds of relief and fear tangled together. "I've got you," Ray said, kneeling down with a groan, his old joints protesting the movement. "I've got you both. Just hold still." He sawed at the zip tie around Sarah's wrists first, his hands trembling almost as much as hers. The plastic was tougher than he expected, and it took him longer than he wanted, but finally it snapped, and Sarah's arms fell free, immediately wrapping around herself like she needed to hold her own body together. "Emma next," Sarah gasped. "Please, Emma next." Ray moved to the girl, his old fingers fumbling with the knife, sawing carefully so he wouldn't nick her skin in the darkness. Emma didn't say anything, just stared straight ahead, her eyes wide and glassy, the kind of look Ray had seen before on men coming home from war, back when he was young enough to remember faces like that clearly. He remembered something else, too. Something important. His hand went to his coat pocket, pulling out the small card Bear had given every neighbor on the street 2 years back when the trouble with a different gang had scared folks enough to want reassurance. It had the clubhouse number printed on it, an emergency line Bear said to use if anything ever felt wrong. Ray dialed it with the same shaking hands, the phone tucked against his shoulder while he kept sawing at the last tie around Emma's wrists. "This is Ray Alvarez," he said when someone picked up. "Kelly's neighbor. There's been trouble at the house, men in masks, tied up Sarah and Emma to the fence. I already called 911. Somebody needs to get Bear." In the distance, faint but growing, Ray thought he heard the first hint of a siren cutting through the quiet Millbrook night. The phone call came in at 11:42 at night, and Bear would remember that number for the rest of his life. He was standing in the gravel lot of the Comstock County Clubhouse, helping load the last of the donated toys into the truck bed, when Tank's phone buzzed against his hip. Tank answered it without much thought, the way a man answers a call at the end of a long day. Bear watched his friend's face change in the space of 2 seconds. The easy grin fell away. The color drained out of his cheeks. "Say that again," Tank said, and his voice had gone tight and flat. Bear was already moving toward him before Tank lowered the phone. "Bear." Tank's hand came up, steadying, like he was trying to brace a wall before it fell. "It's Ray Alvarez. He says Sarah and Emma are hurt, tied up, masked men at the house." The world tilted sideways for Bear Kelly. He didn't remember running to his bike. He didn't remember pulling his helmet on or kicking the engine to life. The next clear thing in his mind was the wind screaming past his ears and the double yellow line of the highway blurring under his headlight, 6 other engines roaring behind him like thunder chasing lightning. His hands shook on the handlebars. Not from the cold. From something worse. Something that clawed up from his stomach into his throat and made it hard to breathe. Sarah's face flashed behind his eyes. Emma's laugh, the one she'd had since she was small, bright and easy. He pictured them scared. He pictured them hurt. He pictured 100 terrible things in the space of a single mile marker, and every one of them made him twist the throttle harder. Tank pulled up alongside him, close enough to shout over the engines, "Bear, ease up!" Bear didn't answer. He couldn't. His jaw was clenched so tight it ached. "Bear!" Tank shouted again. "You go in hot and you crash before you even get there, and then what good are you to them? You hear me? Breathe. Just breathe and ride." The words cut through the roar in Bear's skull like a hand grabbing his collar. He forced air into his lungs. One breath, then another. His hands loosened on the grips, just enough. "They're alive," Tank said, steady now, like he was saying it as much for himself as for Bear. Ray said alive, hurt, scared but alive. You focus on getting home in one piece so you can hold them. That's the job right now. Bear nodded once, sharp, and kept riding. The dark fields blurred past. Every mile felt like 10. His mind kept spinning through fury and fear in equal measure, imagining the men who had done this, imagining what he would do with his hands if he found them. But under all of it, Tank's voice kept anchoring him, over and over. Get home. Get home. Get home. When they finally turned onto Larkspur Street, Bear's whole body went cold. Red and blue lights washed across the front of his house, painting the trees and the fence in strange colors. There were more cars than he expected, but no chaos, no screaming, just quiet, orderly motion. Neighbors standing along the sidewalk in bathrobes and coats, some of them holding steaming mugs, one woman draping a blanket over Sarah's shoulders on the porch. Bear was off his bike before it fully stopped, dropping the kickstand without looking, and he crossed the yard in long strides that ate up the distance. Sarah saw him first. She stood, and the blanket slipped from her shoulders, and she was in his arms before he even reached the steps, her whole body shaking against his chest. Emma followed a half-second later, burying her face into his side, her small hands fisting into his jacket like she was afraid to let go. "I'm here," Bear said, his voice cracking, his arms wrapping around both of them at once. "I'm here. I've got you. I've got you both." Over Sarah's shoulder, Bear saw Sheriff Dale Whitfield standing near the fence, calm and steady, directing an officer with a clipboard. The sheriff met Bear's eyes and gave him a small nod, the kind that said, "They're safe. We've got this handled." It was Whitfield's phone that caught Bear's attention next. The sheriff was scrolling through something on the screen. Footage from the doorbell camera. Frozen on a frame of a masked man standing near the fence. Phone pressed to his ear, head tilted down like he was listening to someone give him instructions. The morning light came in soft through the kitchen window, but it didn't feel soft to Bear. It felt like it was showing him too much. He hadn't slept. He'd sat on the edge of the bed most of the night, listening to Emma's breathing through the wall, checking on her twice, 3 times, just to make sure her chest was still rising and falling the way it should. Now he sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee going cold in front of him, and across from him sat Sheriff Dale Whitfield, a stack of papers and an old leather binder spread out between them like a puzzle nobody wanted to solve. "Walk me through it again," Whitfield said. His voice was calm, the same calm he'd had standing in the yard the night before. He had a way of making chaos feel like it could be managed, one piece at a time. Bear rubbed his eyes. "The Vipers and us, we had bad blood, maybe 8, 9 years back. Territory dispute. Some ugly words, a few ugly nights. But it got settled. There was a sit-down. Money changed hands to smooth it over. And after that, nothing. No debt, no open account. It was done." He tapped the leather binder in front of him. "This is the club ledger. Every dollar we've spent or taken in for the last decade. Tank keeps it clean. I keep it cleaner. There is nothing in here that says we owe the Vipers a nickel." Whitfield turned pages slowly, his reading glasses low on his nose. He was a careful man, the kind who read things twice before he believed them once. "I called their charter president myself this morning," he said, quietly. "Didn't tell him why. Just asked if there was any outstanding business between your clubs." "And?" "He laughed at me, said the debt was settled years ago, and as far as he knew, everybody moved on." Whitfield closed the binder and folded his hands on top of it. "Bear, there's no debt. Not on paper, not in memory, not anywhere I can find." The words landed heavy in the quiet kitchen. Bear felt something shift in his chest, anger curling up from a different place now. Not at the men who tied his wife and daughter to a fence, at whoever had sent them. "So the whole thing was a lie," Bear said slowly, testing the shape of it. "Somebody made up a debt that never existed, paid those men, or ordered them, to come after my family over nothing. Looks that way?" Whitfield leaned back in his chair. "Which means this wasn't really about you owing anybody money. It was about something else. Somebody wanted this to happen. Wanted it to look a certain way." Bear thought of the frozen image on the sheriff's phone the night before. The masked man with his head tilted down, listening to a voice on the other end of a call like a soldier taking orders. Not from a rival club leader, from someone else. His hands curled into fists on the table, old instincts rising up in him, instincts that said, "Find them, make them answer for this with something other than words." He could feel the pull of it, familiar and hot. But he made himself breathe. He thought of Tank's voice on the highway. He thought of Sarah's face in the porch light, safe because of quiet, careful people, not violent ones. He thought of Whitfield standing in his yard, handling everything with order instead of chaos. "I'm not going to go looking for blood," Bear said, more to himself than to the sheriff. "I built something here, trust. I'm not going to burn it down over one bad night, no matter how much I want to." Whitfield studied him for a long moment, something like respect passing over his face. "That's the right call, Bear." Bear nodded, and then something else tugged at his mind, something Whitfield had said. Somebody wanted this to happen. Not just to scare his family, to hurt him somehow, in a way that would last. He thought about the Millbrook Children's Fund, the board meetings, the fundraising numbers, David Pierce's easy smile at the last gala planning session. He thought about how his name was tied to that charity now, his reputation stitched into every dollar it raised. He stood up from the table and reached for the phone on the counter. "Who are you calling?" Whitfield asked. "Ruth Alvarado," Bear said, already dialing. "If somebody's playing games with my name, I want somebody who can read numbers better than anybody in this county looking at where that money's really going." The Millbrook Children's Fund office sat above the old hardware store on Main Street. 3 small rooms with a window unit that rattled when it ran, and a coffee maker that had seen better decades. Ruth Alvarado climbed the narrow stairs that afternoon with a rolling briefcase behind her, her silver hair pinned up neat, her reading glasses already perched on her nose like she was ready for business before she'd even said hello. Bear held the door for her. "Thanks for coming so fast, Ruth." "When you called me sounding like that, I wasn't going to sit around." She looked up at him, sharp eyes softening for just a second. "How's Sarah? Emma?" "Shaken. Getting better." He didn't say more than that. There wasn't more that felt right to say out loud in an office with thin walls. David Pierce came around the corner from the back room with his usual smile, the kind that showed just enough teeth to seem friendly without trying too hard. He wore a blue button-down and khakis, the picture of a man who belonged on a charity board. And he held out his hand to Ruth like they were old friends, even though they'd only met a handful of times before. "Ruth, good to see you. Bear tells me you're going to help us with some bookkeeping." "Routine audit," Ruth said smoothly, shaking his hand once and letting go. "Every fund like this should get a fresh set of eyes every few years. Keeps everybody honest, keeps donors trusting you." She said it plain, no edge to it at all, like she was talking about the weather. David's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes flickered, there and gone so fast that if Ruth hadn't spent 40 years reading people across a desk, she might have missed it. "Of course," he said. "Whatever you need. We've got nothing to hide here." "Never said you did," Ruth answered, already unpacking a folder from her briefcase. "I'll need 3 years of records. Bank statements, deposit slips, expense reports, receipts for anything over $200, and the board meeting minutes for that whole stretch." "3 years," David repeated, and for a moment his voice had a different weight to it, careful instead of casual. "That's a lot of paper." "I work slow and careful," Ruth said, not looking up from her folder. "Or I don't work at all." Bear watched the exchange without saying much, letting Ruth do what she did best. He'd seen her go toe-to-toe with insurance companies twice her size back when she'd helped his mother years ago, back before the bakery, back before any of this. She had a way of asking simple questions that left no room to squirm out of. "I'll have Denise pull everything together," David said, gesturing toward the back room where the fund's part-time assistant kept the filing cabinets. "Might take a day or two to get it all organized." "Take your time," Ruth said, though something in her tone suggested she'd notice if it took too long. "I'm not going anywhere." They spent the rest of the afternoon in the back room, boxes of records stacked on a folding table, Ruth working through them with a calculator and a legal pad, her pen scratching steady lines down columns of numbers. David hovered for the first hour, offering explanations for things nobody had asked about yet, until Bear finally suggested he head home, that they had it handled. David left with a smile that didn't quite reach all the way up. By the time the sun dropped low over Main Street, Ruth had a stack of pages marked with yellow sticky notes, question marks scrawled in the margins. That evening, Bear's phone rang while he was drying dishes in the kitchen, Sarah humming softly at the stove behind him. "Bear," Ruth said, her voice lower than usual, careful. "Something's off in these numbers. I can't tell you what yet, not for sure. I need another day, maybe 2, to run it all the way down." "Off how?" Bear asked, setting the towel down. "Just off," Ruth said. "Give me time. I don't want to point a finger till I'm certain who I'm pointing it at." Across town, in a bedroom lit only by the glow of her phone screen, Emma sat cross-legged on her bed, headphones in, eyes fixed and unblinking, replaying the same 10 seconds of audio over and over again. The Night of the Fence still played behind Emma's eyes whenever she closed them. Clear as a movie she couldn't stop watching. It had happened fast, but somehow, in her memory, it moved slow. That was the strange thing about fear. It stretched time out like taffy. She had been standing by the porch steps when the trucks pulled up, headlights cutting through the dark too quick and too rough for anyone friendly. 4 men climbed out, faces covered in black cloth, boots heavy on the gravel. Her mother had grabbed her hand so hard it hurt, pulling her back toward the door. But there wasn't time. There was never enough time. One of the men had grabbed Emma by the arm, his glove rough against her jacket sleeve. And that was when she remembered. Not fear. Not yet. She remembered her father's voice instead, steady and low, the way he always said it when she was scared of something. "Watch everything. Panic later, Em. Details are what save you. Details are what solve things." So she watched, while the man pulled a zip tie tight around her wrist and looped it through the wrought iron fence. Emma's other hand slid slow and careful into her jacket sleeve, where her phone had been tucked since the trucks first came up the road. Some instinct in her already telling her something was wrong before she could even name it. Her thumb found the record button through the fabric. She didn't dare look down at the screen. She kept her eyes forward, blank and scared looking on the outside, her heart a hammer in her chest, but her hand angled just enough so the phone's camera pointed out from the loose cuff of her sleeve, catching the men, catching the fence, catching everything. She remembered the smell of the night, gasoline and cold air. She remembered her mother's breathing beside her, fast and shaking. She remembered one of the men stepping back from the others, pulling a phone from his jacket, answering a call that came in low and buzzing. "Yeah," the man had said, voice muffled behind his mask. "Yeah, it's done, just like you said." A pause. "No, they don't know nothing. It'll look right." The man had listened for a moment, nodding even though whoever was on the other end couldn't see him do it. Then he'd said one more thing before hanging up, something Emma couldn't quite make out over the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. He'd tucked the phone away and rejoined the others, and moments later the trucks were gone, taillights disappearing down the road, leaving her and her mother tied to the fence in the dark until the sheriff's lights came instead. She hadn't told anyone about the phone. Not that night, not since. She'd meant to tell her father she really had, but every time she tried, the words felt too heavy, and there was a small, stubborn part of her that wanted to be the one who solved it. Not the girl who got tied to a fence, the girl who caught the truth. Now back in her room, laptop open on her knees, Emma finished running the last stretch of audio through the enhancement app she'd found online, the same one she'd used for a school project last year to clean up a shaky video interview. The waveform bounced and smoothed under her fingers as she adjusted the settings one more time, isolating the muffled phone call from the wind noise and the rustle of fabric. She pressed play, headphones snug over her ears. Yeah, it's done. Just like you said." The voice was clearer now, sharper, though still layered with static. "No, they don't know nothing. It'll look right." Then the last part, the part she'd never been able to make out before. It came through this time, faint but there, familiar in a way that made her stomach twist tight. A voice she thought she recognized, though she couldn't place it exactly, couldn't be sure enough yet to say it out loud to anyone. She played it again. and again. Downstairs, she heard her mother's voice call up through the house. "Emma, dinner's ready, come on down." Emma sat frozen for one more second, staring at the screen, at the little waveform still glowing faintly in the dark of her room. "Coming," she called back, and closed the laptop. By Monday morning, the whole town knew. Sarah saw it first in the bakery. She unlocked the front door at 6, like always, flipped the sign to open, and by 6:15, there were already people lined up outside, more than she'd seen in months. Mrs. Kowalski from the hardware store, the Fentons, who ran the gas station, old Mr. Ruiz, who hadn't come in since his wife passed, standing there in his coat with his hands folded like he was waiting for church to start. "Heard what happened," he said when he reached the counter, voice gruff but kind. "Figured you could use the business. Give me 24 of whatever you got." Sarah's eyes stung. She blinked it away and started boxing pastries, her hands moving on their own while her heart tried to catch up. It went on like that all day. The bell over the door rang so often Sarah lost count. People bought bread they didn't need, coffee they'd normally skip, cookies for kids who were already at school. Nobody made a big speech about it. They just showed up, quiet and steady, the way Millbrook did things. At the house, the porch told its own story. By the time Bear got home from the garage that evening, there were 4 casserole dishes stacked by the door, foil tops sealed tight, sticky notes on each one. "Thinking of you all. Praying for your family. Emma is one brave girl." One dish, from the Whitfields down the road, had a hand-drawn smiley face on the note, like whoever wrote it wasn't quite sure what else to say but wanted to say something anyway. Bear stood there a long moment, looking at the dishes, at the porch light glowing warm above them, at the fence beyond it that still made his stomach clench every time he looked at it. Then he picked up the casseroles 2 at a time and carried them inside. "People are good," he said to Sarah, setting them on the counter. "Even when the world tries to convince you they ain't." Sarah wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her head between his shoulder blades. "They love this family, Marcus. That's all this is." At school, word had gotten around too, the way it always does with teenagers, but not the way Emma feared. She'd braced herself for whispers, for kids looking at her like she was fragile, something broken that needed careful handling. Instead, when she walked into the gym for the Monday assembly, Principal Danvers called her name from the podium. "I want to take a moment," he said, looking out over 300 restless students, "to talk about courage, not the kind you see in movies, the real kind." He found Emma in the crowd and nodded toward her. "Emma Kelly went through something scary this weekend, and from what I understand, she kept her head. She stayed calm. She thought clearly when most of us would have panicked. That's the kind of strength I hope all of you carry with you someday." The gym erupted into applause. Emma sat, frozen, cheeks burning, not from embarrassment exactly, but from something heavier. She smiled the way she was supposed to smile, ducked her head the way she was supposed to duck it. But underneath it all, guilt sat like a stone in her stomach. They were praising her for staying calm. They didn't know she was still hiding the one thing that mattered most. That evening, as Sarah set the table and Bear was out back checking the fence posts, a car Emma didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. Sleek, silver, freshly washed. David Pierce climbed out, straightening his jacket, a bottle of wine tucked under one arm like he was arriving at a dinner party instead of a family that had just been terrorized. "Marcus," David called warmly, crossing the yard, "I had to come see for myself that you all were okay." Bear straightened up from the fence, wiping his hands on his jeans. "We're managing." "Good. Good." David set the wine on the porch railing, glancing toward the house, toward Sarah moving behind the kitchen window. Listen, I don't want to intrude. I just wanted to say, the board and we're all just so relieved nobody was hurt. He lowered his voice, leaning in like they were sharing something private. Between us, Marcus, I think the fastest way through this is letting the sheriff wrap it up quick. Call it what it probably is. Some gang trying to shake you down and move on. The gala's coming up. The fund can't afford this hanging over it for weeks. Bear studied him for a long moment, saying nothing. Ruth's kitchen smelled like coffee and old paper. She'd lived in the same little house on Chestnut Street for 40 years, and the kitchen table, scratched oak with a wobble in the left leg, had seen more math problems solved than most classrooms. Tonight it was covered edge to edge with spreadsheets, printed bank statements, and a calculator with buttons worn smooth from decades of use. "Sit," Ruth said, not looking up. She had her reading glasses pushed low on her nose, and a yellow highlighter clenched between her teeth like a woman 20 years younger. Bear pulled out the chair across from her, the wood creaking under his weight. He'd come straight from the garage, still smelled like motor oil and metal, and he felt out of place in Ruth's tidy little kitchen with its lace curtains and ceramic rooster salt shakers. But Ruth had called him an hour ago, voice tight in a way he'd never heard from her, and told him to come now, not tomorrow, now. "Talk to me, Ruth," he said. She slid a stack of papers across the table. "You know I've been going through the fund's books since Sunday. 3 years of statements. At first I figured I was looking for something big, a missing chunk, one bad month." She tapped the highlighter against the page. "That's not what this is." Bear frowned, looking down at the numbers. Rows and rows of small transactions, none of them dramatic. $200 here, $350 there, never more than $500 at a time. "I don't understand what I'm looking at." "That's because you're not supposed to understand it," Ruth said. "That's the whole point. Nobody looks twice at $500. Not when it's buried in a budget that moves tens of thousands a month for supplies, printing, event costs. But look here." She pulled out a second sheet, a list of vendor names. "Every single one of these small withdrawals goes to the same vendor. Millbrook Event Solutions. Ring a bell?" Bear shook his head slowly. "It shouldn't, because it doesn't exist." Ruth pulled off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, tired in a way that went past the hour. "I called the state business registry this afternoon. No such company registered in this county. No address that checks out. No tax filings. It's a shell, Marcus. A fake name somebody set up so money could move through it and look legitimate on paper." Bear felt something cold settle in his chest. He picked up one of the statements, running his thumb down the column of numbers. Small, steady, patient. Whoever did this hadn't been greedy. They'd been careful. "How much are we talking?" "Add it all up over 3 years," Ruth said. "Just under $240,000. The number hit him like a fist to the sternum. He set the paper down slow, like it might burn him. $240,000, he repeated, like saying it twice might make it smaller. It didn't. "Little bits, siphoned off month after month," Ruth said. "Smart, patient. Somebody who knew exactly how much they could pull without anybody noticing the math didn't add up, and somebody who had access to move it without raising a single flag." She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, watching him carefully. "Marcus, I've been doing this kind of work for 40 years. I've seen sloppy thieves and careful ones. This is a careful one." Bear sat there a long moment, jaw tight, staring at the fake vendor name, like it might rearrange itself into an answer. "Ruth," he said finally, voice low and even, the way it got when something serious was sitting on his chest. "Who has signing authority on that account? The one this Event Solutions vendor is tied to?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She reached over, pulled one more sheet from the bottom of the stack, and turned it around so it faced him. A single line, highlighted in yellow, near the bottom of the page. "There's only one name on it," she said quietly. "David Pierce." The kitchen went very still. Bear stared at the name, and in his mind, he saw David standing in his driveway just hours ago, wine bottle tucked under his arm, voice smooth and warm, urging him to let the sheriff wrap things up quick, to stop stirring up trouble before the gala. The fund can't afford this hanging over it for weeks. Bear's hands curled slowly into fists on the table. The sheriff's office was quiet at 11 o'clock at night. Most of the building sat dark, except for one window near the back where Dale Whitfield's desk lamp threw a small circle of yellow light across a mess of papers. Bear sat across from him in a chair too small for his frame, elbows on his knees, staring at the same fake vendor name Ruth had shown him 3 hours before. "Millbrook Event Solutions," Dale said, typing the name into his computer for the 3rd time. "Nothing. No business license filed with the state. No local permit. It's a ghost." "Ruth already told me that part," Bear said. "I need to know where the ghost lives." Dale leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking under him. He was a careful man, the kind who liked to check something twice before he said it out loud. And Bear had learned over the years that this slowness wasn't weakness. It was how Dale made sure that when he finally did say something, nobody could knock it down. "We can't go through official channels yet," Dale said. "Not without a paper trail that holds up. If word gets back to David that we're digging, he could shred anything left. Or worse, he lawyers up before we've got enough to make it stick." "So what do we do?" "We do what any 2 guys with too much coffee and no social life do at midnight," Dale said, almost smiling. "We dig through public records ourselves. Slow, quiet. Nobody else in this building even needs to know we're here." They worked side by side for the next 2 hours. They only sound the hum of the old computer and the occasional creak of the building settling. Dale pulled records from the county clerk's office database, cross-referencing every business filing that shared even a partial match with the fake vendor's tax ID number Ruth had dug up from the bank statements. Bear, who wasn't much for computers, sat with a legal pad and a pen, writing down every name, every address, every dead end, crossing out one lead after another as it went nowhere. Around 1 a.m, Dale sat up straighter. "Marcus, look at this." Bear leaned across the desk. On the screen was a business registration filed 18 months earlier. Not for Millbrook Event Solutions. For a business called Millbrook Events and Solutions, LLC, the words rearranged just enough, with an ampersand thrown in like a fingerprint smudged just enough to avoid an exact match. "That's not a coincidence," Bear said, voice low. "No," Dale agreed. "That's somebody trying to be clever, just not clever enough." He clicked into the filing details. The registered address wasn't an office building or a storefront. It was a small mailbox rental place 2 towns over, the kind of shop that rented private boxes by the month for people who didn't want their business tied to a home address. Dale pulled up a second window, cross-checking the box number against a customer list obtained from an old case years back when the mailbox shop had been connected to a mail fraud investigation that never went anywhere. There, buried 3 pages into a list nobody had looked at in years, was the name attached to that box. David Pierce. Bear didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stared at the name on the screen. The same name that had smiled at him in the driveway that afternoon. Wine bottle tucked under his arm, telling him to let it go, to trust the system, to not stir up more trouble before the gala. "There it is," Bear said finally, voice tight. "Motive, means, all of it." Dale rubbed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at the corners of his face. "It's damning, Marcus, I won't lie to you, but it's not enough yet." "Not enough?" Bear's voice rose, just slightly, before he caught himself and brought it back down. "Dale, the man's name is sitting right there, on a fake company. tied straight to the account Ruth found. I know, Dale said, holding up a hand, calm as ever. And we're going to nail him with it. But right now, everything we have is what a defense lawyer would call circumstantial. A mailbox, a similar name. It proves opportunity. It doesn't prove he pulled the trigger on that fence attack, and it doesn't prove where the money actually went once it left that account. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, meeting Bear's eyes steady and sure. We go public too soon, with anything less than ironclad, and David walks. Worse, he comes after you and your family even harder, because now he knows we're onto him. Bear sat back, jaw tight, but he nodded slowly. So we keep digging. We keep digging, Dale said. Quiet, careful, until there's nothing left for him to twist his way out of. Emma sat cross-legged on her bed, laptop balanced on a pillow, headphones pressed tight against her ears. The house was quiet. Down the hall, she could hear the low murmur of the television, her mom probably watching some baking show she'd already seen twice. Her dad wasn't home yet, still out somewhere with the sheriff, doing whatever grown-ups did when they thought kids were asleep. She wasn't asleep. She hadn't really slept much at all since that night. On her screen, a sound wave stretched out in jagged green lines, the same 10 seconds of audio she'd been fighting with for almost 2 weeks. She'd downloaded 3 different apps to clean it up, watched a dozen tutorial videos made by people who probably had no idea a 14-year-old was using their tricks to solve something this big. Each time, the voice underneath the wind and the scuffling and her own scared breathing got a little clearer. Tonight, it finally broke through. She adjusted the noise filter one more notch, held her breath, and pressed play. Just get it done. He needs to see what happens when people forget their place. The words were crisp now, clean. A man's voice, smooth and clipped, the kind of voice that sounded like it belonged on a stage or in a boardroom, not coming out of a masked stranger's phone in the middle of an attack. Emma's hands were shaking a little as she opened a new tab. She typed Millbrook Children's Fund Gala David Pierce speech into the search bar, and within seconds she found it. A video from 2 years back, posted on the fund's old page. David standing at a podium in a gray suit, smiling that easy smile he always wore, thanking donors for their generosity. She turned the volume up on both windows, lined them up side by side, and played them back to back. Just get it done. Thank you all so much for your incredible generosity tonight. Same rhythm, same clipped ending on his words, same strange little pause before he said big words, like he was making sure people noticed how smart he sounded. She played it again. And again. Her stomach twisted tighter each time. It wasn't a maybe anymore. It wasn't a guess. It was him. Emma sat frozen, staring at the screen, the light casting a pale blue glow across her face. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She thought about all the times David had come to their house with wine and pastries, ruffling her hair like she was still 7 years old, telling her dad to relax, to let it go, to trust the system. He had been in on it. He had been the voice on the phone, the one giving orders while 2 men zip-tied her and her mother to their own fence. She felt sick, and underneath the sick feeling was something else, something colder. Fear. Real fear, the kind that made her hands go numb, because now she understood exactly how much this mattered, and exactly how much danger her family could be in if she was right. She couldn't sit on this by herself anymore. Not tonight. Emma closed the laptop, tucked her phone into her pocket, and walked down the hallway on legs that didn't feel entirely like her own. The television flickered against the living room wall. Her mother looked up from the couch, surprised to see her still awake. Em? What's wrong, honey? That was when the front door opened and Bear stepped in, keys jingling, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. He took one look at his daughter's face and stopped in the doorway. "Emma?" he said, voice suddenly sharp with worry. "What happened?" Emma's throat felt tight. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers trembling as she held it out towards them. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice small but steady. "I've had it since that night, since the fence. I didn't tell you because I wanted to figure it out myself first, but I can't sit on it anymore. It's too big, and I'm scared." Sarah rose slowly from the couch, hand pressed to her chest. Bear crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt down in front of his daughter, his eyes locked on hers, searching her face like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Show us," he said quietly. The kitchen table at the Kelly house had seen a lot over the years. Homework, birthday cakes, late-night talks after Bear got home from long rides. Tonight it held something different. Papers, a laptop, 4 cups of coffee going cold while nobody remembered to drink them. Bear sat at the head of the table, his big hands wrapped around his mug like he needed something solid to hold on to. Across from him sat Sheriff Dale Whitfield, still in uniform, his hat resting on the empty chair beside him. Ruth Alvarado sat to his left, reading glasses perched on her nose, a folder of papers spread out in front of her like a hand of cards she was studying carefully. Sarah stood by the counter, arms crossed, too nervous to sit still. "Play it again," Whitfield said, nodding toward Emma's phone, which sat in the middle of the table like it was radioactive. Bear didn't move to touch it. He'd already heard the recording a dozen times since Emma showed them 3 nights ago. Every time, his stomach turned the same way. David's voice. Cold. Certain. "Just get it done." "We don't need to play it again," Ruth said, taking off her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. "We all know what it says. The question is what we do with it." "We arrest him," Bear said. It wasn't the first time he'd said it that night. "Not yet," Whitfield said, calm as ever. "Bear, I know you want this over. Believe me, I do too. But we do this wrong, and a good lawyer gets that recording thrown out. Chain of custody, how it was obtained, the fact that it was recorded by a minor without consent from all parties. David Pierce isn't stupid. He'll have people defending him who know exactly how to pick apart evidence that isn't rock solid." Ruth tapped the folder in front of her. "Which is why this matters more than the audio right now. I'm almost done. 3 years of numbers, moved around, hidden in accounts that look legitimate if you don't know what you're looking for. But I know what I'm looking for." She allowed herself a small, tired smile. "I've got 2 more days of cross-referencing bank records. Once that report is finished, it won't matter how good his lawyer is. Numbers don't lie, and I can show exactly where every dollar went." 2 days, Bear repeated. "The gala's in 2 days." "I'm aware," Ruth said dryly. Sarah finally spoke, her voice tight. "So he's just going to be there, at the gala, standing on that stage, shaking hands, smiling at everyone while we sit there knowing what he did to my daughter." "I know it's hard," Whitfield said gently. "But if we move too soon, he wiggles out of this. If we wait, we make sure this sticks, all of it. The embezzlement, the attack, all of it tied together so there's no way out for him." Bear looked at Sarah, then at Ruth, then back at the sheriff. Every instinct he'd built over 20 years of leading the Iron Guardians told him to handle this the old way. Fast. Direct. But he'd promised himself something after the fence, after watching Dale secure that scene instead of letting things turn into chaos. He'd promised he'd trust the system this time. 2 days, Bear finally said, the words heavy in his mouth. "We wait for the report. Then we end this. All the way. Ruth reached over and patted his hand. You're doing the right thing, Marcus. I promise you that. He nodded, even though every muscle in his shoulders stayed tight as a fist. Sarah pushed the front door open, arms wet up to the elbow with flour, later that same evening. The moment she stepped inside, the smell of vanilla and cinnamon rolled through the house, warm and familiar. She'd promised herself, gala or no gala, David or no David, tonight would be a normal night for her family. In the kitchen, dozens of small paper boxes sat in neat rows across the table, waiting to be filled with sugar cookies for the toy drive. Emma sat cross-legged on a stool, a roll of red ribbon in her lap, carefully tying bows onto each box, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration, the way it always did when she focused hard on something. "You're getting good at that," Sarah said, setting down a tray of cookies fresh from the oven. "Tank taught me a trick," Emma said, holding up a perfectly looped bow. "Says it's the same knot they use for tying down cargo on the bikes." From the doorway, Bear watched them both, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Emma's hands moved quick and sure, tying bow after bow, laughing when one came out lopsided and trying again without complaint. He thought about the phone sitting upstairs in her room. The recording. The courage it took for a 14-year-old to sit with something that heavy for 2 weeks, working it out on her own before finally trusting the grown-ups around her. Watch everything. Panic later, he'd always told her. She'd done exactly that. And more. The Millbrook Community Center had never looked so beautiful. Gold lights hung in strings across the ceiling, and every table wore a white cloth with a small pine wreath in the middle. A banner stretched over the stage read, "Millbrook Children's Fund. 15 years of giving back." Somewhere, a string quartet from the high school played soft music, though most people were too busy talking and laughing to really listen. Bear stood near the back wall in his one good suit, the collar feeling tight around his neck the way it always did at these things. He wasn't a suit kind of man. He was a leather vest kind of man. But tonight, for Sarah and Emma, he wore it anyway. "You clean up all right, Bear," Tank said, clapping him on the shoulder. Tank had traded his cut for a blazer, too, though it strained a little across his big frame. "Don't get used to it," Bear said, but he was smiling. Across the room, Sarah stood by a long table covered in trays from her bakery. Cookies shaped like toy soldiers and gingerbread ornaments were stacked high, and the tray kept emptying faster than she could refill it. A woman Bear didn't recognize was writing something on a notepad, nodding eagerly as Sarah talked. "Triple," Sarah told him later, breathless when he made his way over. "My orders this week. Triple what they normally are. People keep saying they want to support us. Support Emma." She looked like she didn't quite know what to do with all of it, her cheeks pink from more than just the oven heat. Bear squeezed her hand. "You built this bakery from nothing. They're not just supporting us. They're supporting you." Across the room, Emma stood near the stage in a blue dress Sarah picked out for her, looking a little uncomfortable, with all the attention but standing tall anyway. Principal Davis, a tall woman with silver hair and kind eyes, had a hand on Emma's shoulder and was talking to a small cluster of parents and a reporter with a notepad. "This young woman," Principal Davis was saying, loud enough for people nearby to hear, "showed more courage in one night than most adults show in a lifetime. Millbrook Middle School is proud to call her a student." The small crowd clapped. Emma's cheeks went red, and she glanced toward her dad, who gave her a small nod. Watch everything. Panic later. She'd done him proud, and she knew it, even if the attention still felt strange sitting on her shoulders. Bear felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for weeks. He looked around the room, at Sarah's empty cookie trays, at Emma being praised instead of pitied, at the donors writing checks near the silent auction table, the photographers snapping pictures for the paper, the whole town wrapped around his family like a blanket instead of turning away from it. Maybe, he thought, this was what it looked like when years of doing the right thing finally paid off. He was still holding on to that warm feeling when Ruth appeared at his elbow, tugging gently on his sleeve. Her face was serious, her reading glasses pushed up into her gray hair like she'd forgotten to take them off after reviewing papers all afternoon. "Marcus," she said quietly, pulling him a few steps away from the crowd, near a corner where the noise of the party faded just enough to talk. "I finished the report an hour ago." Bear's stomach tightened. "And?" "Airtight," Ruth said. "Every dollar, every transfer, 3 years of it, all traced back to accounts David set up under shell names. I've already sent copies to Dale. He's got it. It's done, Bear. We have him." Relief and dread mixed together in Bear's chest, a strange, heavy feeling. Part of him wanted to find David right now, right there at the party, and end it. But he thought of his promise. Trust the system. Do it right. "Okay," Bear said slowly. "So we wait for Dale to make his move." Ruth nodded, though her eyes stayed sharp with worry. "That's the plan." Before Bear could say anything else, the microphone on stage let out a sharp squeal of feedback, cutting through the music and chatter. The room quieted, heads turning toward the small stage at the front. David Pierce stood there, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, holding the microphone in one hand and smiling out at the crowd like he owned the room. "If I could have everyone's attention," David said, his voice smooth and confident, carrying easily over the hush that fell across the gala. "There's something I think this town deserves to hear." Bear felt Ruth's hand tighten on his arm. Something was wrong. David never asked for the microphone unless he had a plan. "Thank you all for coming tonight," David said, flashing his easy smile at the crowd. 15 years of the Children's Fund. 15 years of this town giving so much to kids who need it. I'm proud to have been part of that." People clapped. A few raised their glasses. Bear stood still, watching David's eyes. They were too calm. Too ready. "But I have to say something difficult," David went on, and his voice dropped just enough to sound heavy with reluctance. "Something I've been wrestling with for weeks." The room went quiet again. Sarah, standing near the cookie table, turned fully toward the stage, a half-empty tray still in her hands. Emma slipped closer to her mother, her eyes locked on David. "We all know about the terrible thing that happened to Sarah and Emma Kelly," David said. "Tied to their own fence. Terrifying. Every one of us felt for that family." He paused, letting the words sit in the air. "But I've had questions," he continued. "Questions I didn't want to ask because I respect Bear. I do. But questions I can't ignore anymore. Not as someone who cares about this town and this charity." Bear's jaw tightened. Beside him, Ruth whispered, "Marcus, don't move. Let him hang himself." "The Iron Guardians have old debts," David said, his voice smooth as oil. "Old rivalries with other clubs. Debts that go back years, long before Bear became the man we all like to think he is now." He shook his head slowly, like it pained him to say it. What if that attack wasn't some outside threat? What if it was staged? A way to bring in sympathy, boost donations to the fund, and quietly cover up money owed to men Bear used to run with? A wave of murmurs rolled through the crowd, like wind through tall grass. "That's insane," someone near the back said. but their voice wasn't as loud as it needed to be to stop what was happening. "I don't want to believe it either," David said, holding up a hand as if pleading for calm. "But look at the timing. Right before the gala, right when donations were down, right when the fund needed a boost. And who benefited most from the sympathy? Bear's family? Bear's reputation?" Sarah's face went pale. The tray in her hands shook slightly, and a cookie ornament slid off, landing softly on the white tablecloth. She didn't notice. Her eyes were fixed on David, then darting to the faces around her, watching something break that had taken years to build. "He's lying," Emma whispered, grabbing her mother's arm. "Mom, he's lying." But around them heads were turning, whispering. An older man near the silent auction table, one Bear recognized as someone who used to nod politely but never quite meet his eyes, leaned over to his wife and murmured something, his gaze sliding toward Bear with old suspicion creeping back into his face. "I always wondered," a woman near the punch bowl said quietly to her friend, not quiet enough. "You don't just stop being one of those biker types overnight." "They tied up his own wife and daughter?" another voice added, uncertain now. "Seems extreme, even for good publicity." "People do crazy things for money," someone answered. Bear stood frozen, feeling the room shift beneath his feet like the floor itself had tilted. Years of fixing roofs, running toy drives, coaching softball, standing beside Sheriff Whitfield on the courthouse steps every single year. All of it, cracking under the weight of David's calm, reasonable voice, and a story that made just enough sense to plant doubt. He looked at Sarah. Her eyes were wide, glassy, her mouth slightly open like she couldn't find any words. She looked so small suddenly, standing there in her flour-dusted apron amid all that gold light and doubt. He looked at Emma. Her hands were balled into fists at her sides, her face a mixture of fury and fear, watching the same people who had called her brave just an hour ago now, whispering behind their hands, glancing at her father like he was a stranger wearing a stolen face. David lowered the microphone slightly, letting the murmurs build, letting the doubt spread through the crowd like smoke filling a room, and he did not look sorry at all. A reporter near the back, a young woman with a press badge clipped to her blazer, was already scribbling in a notepad. Another one, an older man Bear recognized from the county paper, had his phone out, thumb moving fast across the screen. Bear caught pieces of what they were saying to each other. "Did you get that? Staged incident, quote unquote. Get a picture of the family, get their faces." A woman standing near the silent auction tables, one of the bakery's oldest customers, a sweet gray-haired woman named Doris who bought 24 cinnamon rolls every single Sunday, leaned toward a reporter and said quietly, "I don't know. I always thought Bear was different. But you never really know people, do you?" The reporter wrote that down too. Bear felt his hands curl into fists at his sides, then forced them open again. Tank was suddenly beside him, close enough that Bear could feel the heat coming off him, his old friend's jaw tight as stone. "Say the word, Bear," Tank muttered low enough that only Bear could hear. "I'll shut this whole thing down." "No," Bear said, though his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "That's exactly what he wants. Somebody big and scary losing his temper on stage. Give the cameras that picture and it's over." He made himself breathe. In through his nose, slow, the way he used to teach new club members to calm down before a confrontation. Watch everything, panic later. He'd told Emma that 100 times over the years, never thinking he'd need his own advice standing in a ballroom full of twinkling lights and cookie trays. He stepped toward the small stage where David stood, microphone still loose in his hand, his face arranged into that same expression of practiced concern. David, Bear said, and his voice carried across the quiet room. That's not what happened, and you know it. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, Bear, David said smoothly. I'm just asking questions. Isn't that fair? Don't we owe the donors in this room some honesty? You want honesty? Bear said. Fine. Ask Sheriff Whitfield. Ask the deputies who worked that scene. Ask the neighbors who called 911 before I even knew what happened. Of course they'll back you up, David said, spreading his hands like he was sorry for even having to say it. You've spent years building relationships in this town, Bear. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying it makes it easier to look past things, doesn't it? A ripple of uncomfortable laughter, nervous and small, moved through part of the crowd. Bear felt his face go hot. He looked out at the sea of faces, searching for something solid to hold on to, and found only shifting eyes and uncertain frowns. Somewhere near the drink table, a man in a suit was already typing something into his phone, maybe pulling up an old news story, maybe just texting a friend the gossip. Sarah's hand found Emma's, gripping it tight enough that her knuckles went white. The tray of cookies had been set down somewhere behind her, forgotten. Her eyes were fixed on Bear, and he could see the fear there, not for herself, but for him, for everything they had built together being pulled apart, thread by thread, in front of the entire town. Mom, Emma whispered, her voice tight and low. He's doing it again. He's making everyone believe him. Sarah squeezed her hand tighter, as if she could hold both of them steady through sheer will alone. I know, baby. I know. Around them, the murmurs grew louder, spreading table to table like a fire catching dry grass. Someone near the back asked loudly if the gala was even legitimate anymore, if the money people had donated tonight was safe. A donor who had written a check for $5,000 earlier that evening was now speaking quietly with an assistant, brows knitted with worry. Emma's eyes moved from the crowd to David standing so calm and sure on that stage, to her father standing below him, absorbing blow after blow without a single ounce of the truth, reaching the room. Her jaw set. Her hand slipped free from her mother's. She reached into her jacket pocket, fingers closing around her phone, and began walking toward the stage. Emma's sneakers were quiet on the ballroom floor, but to her, every step sounded like thunder. She wove between round tables covered in white cloth, past the silent auction table with its baskets of wine and gift cards, past Doris, who stopped mid-sentence to stare at her, past the reporter with the notepad who suddenly forgot what she was writing. Nobody stopped her. Maybe nobody knew what to do. A 14-year-old girl walking toward a stage where grown men were fighting with words instead of fists. That wasn't something anyone had a plan for. David saw her first. His smile flickered, just for a second, like a light bulb about to die. Then it came back, smooth as ever. Emma, he said, his voice gentle, the kind of gentle that made Bear's skin crawl. Honey, this isn't really something you need to be part of. Yes, it is, Emma said. Her voice cracked on the second word, and she hated that it cracked, but she kept walking anyway. She stepped up onto the small stage, right past David, and reached for the microphone stand where it sat forgotten near the podium. Bear moved toward her, one step, his heart slamming against his ribs. Emma, sweetheart, you don't have to do this. I know I don't have to, Dad. She looked at him, and for a second she wasn't a scared kid. She was someone older, someone who had spent weeks in her room with headphones on, cleaning up static and background noise until every word was clear. But I want to. She turned to face the crowd. Her hands were shaking. She could feel them shaking, but she planted her feet the way her dad had taught her when she used to bat in softball. Watch everything. panic later. "My name is Emma Kelly," she said, and her voice came out of the speakers louder than she expected, bouncing off the high ceiling of the ballroom. The room, which had been a low buzz of whispers and phone screens, went quiet. "Some of you know me. Some of you probably think you know what happened to me and my mom a few weeks ago." She swallowed hard. Somewhere in the crowd, she saw her mother's face, pale and frozen, hand pressed to her mouth. "You don't," Emma said. "Not really. So before anybody decides what to believe about my dad, I want you to listen to something first." She pulled her phone from her jacket pocket. Her thumb found the file she'd been working on for weeks, the one she'd almost deleted twice out of fear, the one she'd saved instead because some part of her knew this moment was coming. "This is real," she said. "This is what actually happened that night." She plugged her phone into the cable running to the gala's sound system, the same one that had been playing soft music between speeches all evening. Her hands were still shaking as she pressed play. The ballroom filled with sound. First there was wind and gravel crunching, and her own breath, fast and scared, caught on the recording. Then a man's voice, rough and unfamiliar, barking orders, the sound of the zip ties. Her mother's voice, shaking, asking them, "Please, please don't hurt my daughter." Someone laughing, low and ugly, the rattle of the iron fence. People in the crowd shifted, some pressing hands to their mouths, a few chairs scraping back as people leaned forward to hear better. Then, clear as day, a phone rang in the recording. A pause. Footsteps. And a new voice. Calm, controlled, giving instructions like he was ordering lunch instead of terrorizing a family. "Make sure the kid's phone is on her. I want proof for Kelly when he gets home. Don't touch the wife, don't touch the girl, just scare them good. And make it fast, I've got somewhere to be tonight." The voice was smooth. Practiced. Unmistakable. David Pierce's voice, filling every corner of that ballroom. The room went dead silent. Not a whisper, not a cough, not the clink of a single glass. Every eye that had been fixed on Bear a moment ago slowly turned, inch by inch, toward the man standing frozen on the stage beside the podium, his practiced smile gone, his face drained of all its color. David moved first. He didn't say a word. He didn't try to explain, didn't try to smile his way out of it the way he always did. He just turned and ran, shoving past the podium, knocking the microphone stand sideways with a screech of feedback that made half the room flinch. "David!" someone shouted. Maybe one of the other board members, but he didn't stop. He cut across the stage and down the little steps on the far side, his polished shoes slipping on the last one, so he stumbled, catching himself on the edge of a table before shoving off it and stumbling into a run. People scattered out of his way, chairs scraping, a woman in a blue dress grabbing her husband's arm and pulling him back like David might be dangerous now. Might be someone else entirely now that his voice had come out of Emma's phone. He was heading for the side exit, the one near the silent auction table, the one with the fire door that led out to the parking lot. He didn't make it. His shoulder clipped the edge of the donation table, the long one covered in a white cloth with the cardboard boxes stacked on top, the ones people had been dropping envelopes and folded bills into all night for the toy drive. The table rocked, tipped, and went over with a crash that echoed through the ballroom almost as loud as the recording had. Boxes hit the floor, bills scattered across the hardwood, 20s and 10s fluttering like startled birds, a few coins rolling under chairs. Somebody screamed, short and startled, more from shock than fear. David didn't even look back at the mess he'd made. He kept moving, breathing hard, his tie loose and his face white as chalk, heading straight for the door like it was the only thing left in the world that mattered. He didn't get more than 10 feet past the wreckage. Sheriff Dale Whitfield stepped out from near the back wall, where he'd been standing quiet as a shadow all evening, blending in with the catering staff and the coat check line, a folder tucked under one arm. Ruth stood just behind him, her silver hair catching the light, her face calm in a way that made it clear she'd been waiting for this moment for weeks. "That's far enough, David," Dale said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the kind of weight that came from a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how to fill a room without raising his voice. David skidded to a stop, chest heaving, eyes darting toward the fire door like he was still doing the math on whether he could make it. Dale took one more step, closing the distance, and something in David's shoulders just gave up. He sagged, right there in the middle of the ballroom floor, surrounded by scattered dollar bills and toppled cardboard boxes, and 200 people who had come tonight, expecting nothing more than a nice dinner and a few speeches. "David Pierce," Dale said, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest for embezzlement, conspiracy, and orchestrating an act of criminal intimidation against Sarah and Emma Kelly." "This is insane," David said, but his voice had none of its usual polish left in it. It came out thin, cracked, almost pleading. "You don't understand. I can explain. There's context you're missing. This whole thing has been blown out of proportion." "You'll get your chance to explain," Dale said, turning him gently but firmly, pulling his arms behind his back. The cuffs clicked shut, sharp and final in the silence. In front of a judge. He began to read David his rights, the words steady and practiced, the kind of words Dale had said 100 times before, but that landed in that ballroom like something nobody in Millbrook had ever heard spoken out loud. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The crowd watched, frozen, nobody moving to pick up the scattered bills or right the fallen table. Somewhere near the back, a waiter stood with a tray of champagne glasses forgotten in his hands. Sarah had both arms wrapped around Emma now, holding her daughter so tight it was like she was afraid to let go, tears streaking down her face, though she was smiling too, a strange and broken kind of smile. Bear stood exactly where he'd been standing, watching the man who had smiled at him for years, worked beside him for years, get led past the toppled donation table in handcuffs, saying nothing at all. The door closed behind David and Sheriff Whitfield's deputy with a heavy click, and for a moment nobody in the ballroom said anything at all. The only sound was a stray $20 bill drifting off the edge of the toppled table and landing soft on the floor. Dale walked back to the front of the room, straightening his jacket. He picked up the microphone stand David had knocked sideways, set it upright, and tapped it once to make sure it still worked. "Folks," he said, "I know that was a lot to take in. Let me tell you what we actually know, so you're not left guessing." The crowd shifted closer, chairs scraping quietly as people leaned forward. Nobody wanted to miss a word. 3 years ago, Dale said, David Pierce started moving money out of the Millbrook Children's Fund. A little here, a little there. Never enough at once to raise a flag. He used fake vendor invoices, inflated event costs, things that looked normal unless you knew exactly where to look. He glanced toward Ruth, who stood off to the side with her hands folded in front of her, calm as ever. "Ruth Alvarado is the one who found it. Weeks of going through ledgers most people wouldn't have the patience for." A murmur ran through the crowd. Ruth didn't smile, didn't take a bow. She just gave a small nod, the kind of nod that said she'd done her job and didn't need applause for it. "All told," Dale continued, "we're looking at a little over $300,000 missing from this fund. Money that was supposed to go toward toys, school supplies, scholarships for kids in this town." Somewhere in the crowd, a woman gasped. A man muttered a curse under his breath and then apologized to the people around him. "Here's the part that matters most," Dale said, and his voice got a little harder now, a little more serious. David knew the audit was closing in. He knew Ruth was getting close, so he needed a distraction. He needed something big enough to pull Bear Kelly off the board, something that would make people question Bear instead of him. He let that sit for a second. That's why 4 men showed up at the Kelly house 3 weeks ago. That's why Sarah and Emma were tied to that fence. It wasn't a gang dispute. It wasn't some old debt. David paid those men to stage it, to make it look like trouble was following Bear, hoping it would either get Bear thrown off this board or keep him too distracted to notice what was happening in the books. The room went dead silent. Somebody near the back whispered, "Oh my God," soft enough that it still carried in the quiet. Bear stood with his arm around Sarah, and Sarah stood with her arm around Emma, and Emma stood there watching the faces of the crowd change one by one like a wave rolling backward. You could see it happen. The confusion melted first, then came the shame, spreading across the room in a slow blush of realization. These were the same people who had gasped at David's accusations 20 minutes ago. The same people who had looked at Bear like maybe he really had staged the whole thing, like maybe the leather vest and the motorcycle really did mean what the old stories said. Widow Hendricks was the first to move. She was a small woman, silver-haired, still spry despite her 80-some years, and she pushed her way through the crowd with a determination that made people step aside without thinking twice. She didn't say anything to Bear first. She went straight to Sarah, wrapped her thin arms around her, and held on tight. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I should have known better. I should have never doubted you, any of you." Sarah hugged her back, tears slipping down her cheeks again, though these were different tears than the ones from before. That seemed to break something loose in the room. One by one, people came forward. A man Bear had fixed a roof for 2 summers ago shook his hand, and couldn't quite meet his eyes. A woman who ran the flower shop on Main Street hugged Emma and told her she was the bravest girl she'd ever known. Someone pressed an envelope of cash into Sarah's hands, insisting it was for the bakery, for anything they needed. The line kept growing, neighbors and donors and people Bear barely knew, all of them wanting to say the same thing in different ways. "We're sorry. We should have trusted you. We do now." The ballroom emptied slowly, the way a bathtub drains, one small group at a time until only a handful of people were left. The band had packed up an hour ago. Someone had turned down half the lights, so the big room felt softer now, quieter, the gold streamers overhead catching what light remained. Bear found Emma sitting alone at one of the round tables near the back, still wearing her good dress, her shoes kicked off under her chair. She was turning her phone over in her hands, the same phone that had done more that night than anyone could have guessed. Bear walked over slow. His boots were heavy on the wood floor, but the sound felt gentle somehow, like even a big man could learn to walk soft when it mattered. He didn't sit in the chair across from her. He got down on one knee instead, right there in front of her, so they were eye level, so she didn't have to look up at him the way she'd looked up at him her whole life. "Hey," he said. Emma looked at him. Her eyes were tired, but steady. "Hey," she said back. For a second, neither of them said anything else. Bear just looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't let himself do enough these past weeks, too busy chasing down ledgers and old debts and rumors to just sit still and see his daughter. "You know," he said finally, "when I was tying my boots this morning, I was thinking about that night. The fence. I keep thinking about it." Emma's jaw tightened a little. "Me too." I used to think, Bear said, that the worst thing that ever happened to this family was you and your mama getting tied up out there. I thought that was the whole story, the bad part we had to get through. It wasn't? Bear shook his head slow. No, baby. That was just the start of it. The bad guys, they didn't just want to scare us. They wanted the whole town to stop believing in us. In me. And if they'd gotten away with it, they would have. David almost had it done tonight. Right up there on that stage. Emma looked down at her phone again. But you didn't let that happen, Bear said. You didn't just save yourself that night, Emma. You didn't just save your mama. You had that phone going the whole time, scared out of your mind, and you still thought clear enough to press record. That's not luck. That's not an accident. That's you. Emma's eyes went shiny, and she blinked hard, trying to keep it together. You saved the truth, Bear said. That's a bigger thing than most grown men ever do in their whole lives. You hear me? Emma nodded, and then she wasn't holding it together anymore. She leaned forward and Bear wrapped his big arms around her, right there on the floor of the emptying ballroom. And for a minute he just held her while she cried the kind of crying that comes after you've been strong too long. By the time they stood up, a small crowd had drifted back toward them. Sheriff Whitfield stood near the doorway, hat in his hands. Ruth was there too, arms crossed, watching with the kind of soft look she usually kept hidden. Sarah came up beside Bear and slipped her hand into his. Somebody, maybe Widow Hendricks, said, "Bear, say something." Bear looked around at the faces left in the room. Tired faces, honest faces, people who'd come back to say sorry and stayed to hear the rest. "I'll keep it short," Bear said, and a few people laughed soft because everyone knew that was a stretch for him. Folks around here used to think strength meant fists, meant leather and loud engines and men you crossed the street to avoid. I spent a long time trying to prove that wrong. One roof, one bake sale, one toy drive at a time. He put his arm around Sarah, looked down at Emma. But it wasn't the roofs or the toy drives that proved it tonight. It was a 15-year-old girl who kept her head when she was scared out of her mind. It was Ruth going through boxes of numbers nobody else wanted to touch. It was Dale doing his job right, slow and careful, instead of jumping to easy answers. He looked back up at the room. Real strength isn't about who can throw the hardest punch. It's about who shows up, who tells the truth even when it's scary, who trusts the people who've earned it. That's the only kind of strong that ever really matters. The room broke into applause. Warm and full, hands clapping steady in the quiet hall, some people wiping their eyes as they did it. The community center smelled like coffee and cinnamon rolls, courtesy of Sarah's Bakery, which had donated 3 trays for the meeting. Folding chairs sat in rows, most of them filled, and a table up front held a banner that Emma had helped make. It read, "Millbrook Children's Fund," in blue letters, with a little gold star in the corner that Sarah had stitched on herself. Ruth stood behind the podium, wearing her good blue blazer, reading glasses pushed up into her gray hair. She had a folder in front of her, thick with papers, and she tapped it twice before she spoke, like she was making sure it was real. "For those who don't know me," she said, "my name is Ruth Alvarado. I spent 40 years as an accountant. And I thought I was done with numbers. Turns out numbers weren't done with me." A few people laughed. Bear, sitting in the second row between Sarah and Emma, smiled. "Starting today," Ruth went on, "every dollar that comes into this fund will be tracked in a public ledger. Anyone in this town can walk into the office and ask to see it. No exceptions, no closed doors." She looked up over her glasses. "We learned the hard way what happens when a few people get to hide the books from everybody else. That's not happening again. Not on my watch." She talked for a few more minutes about the new committee, 3 parents, a teacher, and Sheriff Whitfield acting as an outside check, all volunteering their time to keep things honest. Bear watched the faces around him nod along, saw Widow Hendricks dab at her eyes with a tissue, saw old Mr. Grady from the hardware store lean over and whisper something to his wife. When Ruth finished, she looked right at Bear. "I also want to say something else. Marcus Kelly stood by this fund when it would have been easier to walk away. His daughter stood up when it would have been easier to stay quiet. This town owes them both more than a round of applause, but it's what we've got, so let's give it." The room stood up. Chairs scraped against the floor. Bear felt his face go warm, and he squeezed Sarah's hand, then reached over and squeezed Emma's shoulder too. Emma ducked her head a little, but she was smiling. Afterward, people lingered the way they do after church, shaking hands, refilling coffee cups, thanking Ruth, thanking Bear, a few even thanking Emma directly, crouching down to tell her she was brave, that she'd done something most adults couldn't have done. Emma said thank you every time, polite, a little shy about it, but standing a little taller each time she heard it. It was late afternoon by the time the Kellys climbed into Bear's truck to head home. Sarah sat up front, Emma in the back with her seatbelt on, the community center shrinking in the side mirror as Bear pulled out onto the road. "Ruth mentioned something to me before we left," Sarah said, turning to look at Bear. "Toy drive numbers. Did you hear that?" Bear shook his head. "No, what did she say?" "Donations are already double what they were this time last year. Double, Bear, and it's not even December yet." Emma leaned forward between the seats. "Double? Seriously?" "Seriously," Sarah said. "She said it's the news coverage. People saw what happened to us, saw how it turned out, and they wanted to be part of something good instead of just reading about the bad part." Bear kept his eyes on the road, but a small, proud smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Guess people trust what they can see with their own eyes. Guess trust like that, once you got it back, it grows fast." "Faster than I thought," Sarah said, resting her head back against the seat. They drove the rest of the way with the windows cracked, the autumn air cool and smelling like fallen leaves, the radio humming low. Emma watched the trees go by, her phone quiet in her lap for once. No need to record anything, just riding home with her parents on an ordinary afternoon that felt, somehow, like a gift. When Bear turned onto their street, the house came into view first, then the yard, then the fence. It was still standing, weathered from the seasons, the white paint chipped in places but unbroken, solid, exactly where it had always been. Saturday morning came bright and cool, the kind of day where the sky looked like it had been washed clean overnight. Bear stood in the driveway in an old T-shirt already speckled with paint, looking at the fence like he was studying a puzzle he'd waited a long time to solve. "All right," he said, clapping his hands together. "Let's get this done." Sarah came out of the house carrying a tray of paint cans, brushes sticking out of the top like flowers in a vase. Emma followed behind her, hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing one of Bear's old flannel shirts that hung down past her knees. "You sure about the colors?" Sarah asked, setting the tray down on the grass. "White base, blue letters," Bear said. Emma picked the blue, said it needed to match the banner from the fund. Emma grinned and popped open a can, the smell of fresh paint sharp in the morning air. "It's got to look official. People are going to see it every day." They started with the base coat first, rolling the white paint over the chipped and weathered wood, covering 3 years of sun damage and rust stains in smooth, even strokes. Bear worked the top rail, his big hands surprisingly gentle with the brush, while Sarah took the middle section and Emma knelt down low to reach the bottom boards. For a while, nobody talked much, just the sound of brushes swishing and birds calling somewhere in the trees. It was peaceful work. The kind that let your mind wander without anywhere bad to go. You know, Sarah said eventually, not looking up from her section. I used to walk past this fence and feel my stomach drop a little, every single time. Bear paused, brush hovering. Yeah, me too. Not anymore, though, Emma said. She was staring at the wood in front of her, at the white paint drying clean and bright. It's just a fence now. Our fence. They kept working through the late morning, stopping only for lemonade and the sandwiches Sarah had made, sitting on the porch steps to eat while the paint dried in the sun. By early afternoon it was time for the letters, and this part they did together. Bear holding the stencil steady while Sarah traced the outline, and Emma filled it in with the blue, her tongue poking out the side of her mouth in concentration, the way it always did when she wanted something to be perfect. Kelly's watch. The letters stretched across the top rail, bold and clear, visible from the road. Underneath, smaller, Emma had insisted on painting a little corkboard frame, a place where neighbors could pin index cards, notes, requests. So people know what it's for, she explained. Not just a name. A place. By late afternoon, they stood back together, the three of them shoulder to shoulder, admiring the finished fence. The white wood gleamed, the blue letters sharp against it, and already Sarah had brought out a small wooden box to nail to the post, filled with index cards and a pencil on a string. First one's gotta be from us, Bear said. Emma took a card, thought for a second, then wrote in careful letters. Need a hand with anything? Just ask. We got you. The Kellys. She pinned it to the board herself, stepping back to admire her work. The sun was beginning to dip low over the trees, painting the sky orange and pink, when the sound of engines rumbled in the distance. It grew louder, then louder still, until 6 motorcycles rounded the corner and rolled up the street, Chrome catching the last of the daylight. Tank was in front, and behind him came the rest of the Iron Guardians, boots hitting pavement one by one as they parked along the curb and walked up to admire the fence. Well, look at that, Tank said, grinning wide beneath his beard. Kelly's watch? I like it, boss. The other brothers nodded their approval, a few reaching out to run their hands along the smooth painted wood, reading the little note Emma had pinned to the board. Bear watched them, watched his family, watched the fence that had once carried so much fear now standing tall and bright under the fading light. He felt Sarah lean into his side, felt Emma slip under his other arm, and he pulled them both in close, holding them there as the sky turned deeper shades of orange and gold. They had come with rope and lies, thinking they could break something. Instead, they'd only proven what Bear had always believed, deep down, in the part of him that never stopped hoping. Love didn't break, loyalty didn't break, and truth, once it found the light, never went back into the dark. Bear held his girls close, his brothers gathered around him, the fence glowing white and blue behind them, and for the first time in a long while, everything felt exactly as it should be. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.